let us now go to the Trimurti, the trio, who successfully organized this event in New Delhi. Mr. Daniel Witt, the president of the ITIC, Mr. Hafiz Choudhury, a TP expert and a member of the United Nations Subcommittee on Transfer Pricing, and Mr. Sumit Dutt Majumder. The Trimurti, the trio, actually earned lots of laurels from the distinguished speakers and the audiences for organizing this event wonderfully well and inviting and ensuring a large gathering of distinguished taxation experts visiting New Delhi from different parts of the world. So let's go to the Trimurti. We have three distinguished guests with us who have been the key architects of this organizing the entire event. The Asia Pacific Taxation Forum, we have Mr. Hafiz Choudhury, a member of the Subcommittee Transfer Pricing of United Nations, and of course another subcommittee on extractives. We have Mr. Daniel, the president of International Tax and Investment Chamber, the real initiator, real driving force behind all this global initiative on taxation issues. We have Mr. Sumit Dutt Majumder, the former chairman of the Central Board of Excise and Customs. So sir, we will start with Mr. Daniel. So please tell us, give us an overview of, you have been rather, swimming in a water where a lot of taxation issues you come across in Asia, in Europe for instance, in different parts of the world. So give us a view where, the New Delhi you are trying to focus on. A lot of experts have come here. So tell us, give us an overview of this.
Well, Shailendra, it's a pleasure to be back in India, and I must say, the title here, I feel a little intoxicated after sitting in a room for 8 hours talking about this heavy agenda throughout the Asia-Pacific region. But we're delighted to be in Delhi. This is the 12th meeting of the Asia-Pacific Tax Forum. Today we gathered representatives from 22 countries. That included 14 Asian countries, and among the 14 Asian countries, 8 of them were from ASEAN. So it was a great level of participation. People who were like deputy tax commissioners, heads of tax policy of ministries of finance, 2 chairmen of budget committees of parliaments, Indonesia and the Philippines. So we had a very distinguished group gathered here in Delhi for what is really, thanks to my colleagues, a world-class international tax meeting. And most importantly, what draws people to this meeting, this being the 12th meeting, this is their meeting. We regularly engage. So form is truly the key word. It's not just we meet once a year, but there's ongoing engagements with research projects, educational programs, and this is our annual meeting. But there's an ownership, there's a collegiality, there's a fellowship. It's fun to be with these people to talk about such intoxicating issues.
Right.
And one of the things that was a great pleasure today was to release this book. We call it the ASEAN Excise Tax Reform Manual. The idea for this book was raised with a series of questions at 2008 meeting in Bali. People were saying, what do we need to do to reform our excise regime ahead of the ASEAN economic integration, the AEC, which is supposed to come in at the end of this year? The answers weren't clear. Even to know what your neighbors were doing on excises, which most public finance scholars think is a pretty easy, straightforward taxation issue. But for Vietnam to know, how does Cambodia, how does Laos, how does Thailand tax automobiles, alcohol, in the details of it was unknown. So this was a extensive cattle inventory and cataloging. And based on that, through a study group that included all 10 ASEAN member states, we've put together a series of recommendations for them to consider as they move forward with their economic cooperation. And I stop short of saying harmonize, because that scares people. Each state has the sovereign right to determine their tax, but it makes sense to cooperate. It makes sense to standardize, particularly on excisable products where you have a lot of externalities, illicit trade. We presented this today, the English one. It's going to be published in Indonesian, Vietnamese, and Thai. And as I said this morning in my opening remarks, while it's a book on ASEAN, the contents are just as relevant for the trade between the 28 states that make up the Union of India.
So this is going to be equally relevant for India?
Yes, very relevant. The title might suggest otherwise, but the material is relevant. So this represents 3 years of work by the people who are meeting today, and it was a real pleasure to present it and have them begin putting it to use as they consider their national policies.
Right.
If you would allow, I just want to share a couple of
key findings,
key trends, phenomena, which we've organized the agenda around. I'll defer to my colleagues to talk about the technical issues in the agenda. But there were 2 things that really drive our meeting today. And number 1 is closer economic integration among the Asian countries. We see it with ASEAN. You're seeing it with trade agreements with India and other countries in the region. You're seeing it more broadly with TPP.
Right.
As the trade barriers fall, some are suggesting that taxation may end up being the last trade barrier. So we were urging the national governments to think of their trade policy and tax policy together. I've said many times that I believe a country's most important trade policy is its tax policy.
Right.
The second regional global trend we're having our discussions in is recognizing that the center of economic and financial gravity is shifting from west to east.
Right.
Now, everybody liked to write stories on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That's the headline.
Right.
But the trade and financial flows over the last 10 years underscore this phenomenon. But we're still living in a world where the tax and trade rules are written and governed by Western institutions. These economies that we're sitting in today, including India, an economy with strong economic growth that is putting in place a government with a budget, cutting corporate tax rates, a pro-growth budget.
Right.
That greatly contrasts, sadly, from my country, the United States, and indeed much of Europe, where they have austerity budgets and their economic performance is tepid at best.
Right.
So I urged my colleagues today to think about these different policies and indeed the macro performance as you consider your tax policies. So those are 2 big pictures in which we're discussing some very hands-on micro policies, which I'll defer to my good colleagues on.
Right, of course. We will certainly move to Mr. Hafiz now. So please tell us, the taxation itself is a huge basket in India, as Mr. Daniel referred to 28 states and a lot of taxes, direct tax side. Transfer pricing is one issue which has emerged as a very key contentious issue in India. A lot of TP adjustments we make. Intangibles turning out to be another bone of contention within the basket of transfer pricing. Tell us, is it different in India, or these are the similar nature of dispute you find elsewhere in the world?
I wouldn't say that it is different. It is part of the growth story of transfer pricing. I have a personal story here. I was directly involved at the early stages of when India was introducing transfer pricing rules, and I was fortunate enough to lecture at your National Academy of Direct Taxes in Nagpur with the first 2 batches of officers who were trained in transfer pricing services. It is a learning process for every country. As they adopt transfer pricing rules, it takes time to learn the principles, to adapt those international principles to local requirements. I would say that India is actually a leader now, from being a norm taker to being part of setting the norms. We certainly see that at the UN transfer pricing meetings, where the Indian positions are now the leading ideas for the developing world.
Okay.
Certainly, India has pioneered some concepts around the interpretation of the arm's length standard and its application to modern principles of trade and the shifting basis of trade. And there will be some disagreement, but I would not say that India is so far out of the range of thinking that it is any different from any other country. So I would say see India as a leader and have a very positive story.
Right. So you are saying that in days to come, probably it will stabilize and the TP disputes will go down.
I would certainly expect so. As capacity within the CBDT grows, as there is more confidence in the processes being used by multinationals, but also there has to be a learning process for multinationals operating in India for the concerns that the Indian Ministry of Finance and Indian policymakers naturally have in terms of protecting the Indian tax base. The other side of the picture is, as was discussed in today's meeting, that India is developing its own, India has some of the fastest growing multinationals in the world. So as Indian companies invest abroad and become much more global, the Indian government itself will begin to recognize the issues of a resident state,
right,
in terms of being a capital exporter.
Absolutely.
So as that acculturization, for lack of a better word,
right,
with these international norms come through, I believe that transfer pricing disputes will be reduced. And I understand there are already some good policy measures being taken, additional capacity being added, APA team is almost doubling in strength, and those are all positive.
Right. So what is the global take on this bright line test? In India, for instance, on the TP, transfer pricing, we have certain methods prescribed as per the provisions of the law. And one test, recently there was a mega high court decision which said that there is no legislative backing therefore, so far as AMP expenses incurred by all the multinationals are concerned, the bright line test was not upheld, it was struck off. So what is the global take on this? What is happening on the bright line test worldwide?
I would not pretend to understand everything about the bright line test, and I certainly would not posit myself as an expert on what is happening in Indian litigation. But as a general trend, I would say that as these norms are adopted, there will be similar discussions in every country. We had in Korea the whole question of secret comparables. Japan, at the early days of introducing its transfer pricing rules, was notorious for applying secret comparables. But over time, as that acculturization that I mentioned comes about, I think these concerns will fade, and as capacity is developed, as confidence is developed within the CBDT, we will see these tensions abate significantly.
Okay. So apart from transfer pricing, so any other initiative where the Asia Pacific Forum is going to talk about some of the key areas, maybe you would like to highlight some of those? And
maybe one day we will have a similar manual on application of tax incentive.
Okay.
So I guess that would be one of the leading areas. We also have other initiatives around capacity building, around consideration of tax expenditure models. Right. So there are a number of other areas for discussion.
So BEPS is one of them.
BEPS, the whole idea of action plan on BEPS is pretty much as was mentioned by Jeffrey Owens today, is really a summary of a number of issues that have been around in the technical tax scene. What is different about BEPS, however, is that this has now been elevated to a political level,
right,
and there's a lot more interest at a political level of doing it. And
right,
transfer pricing is part of that, but we will address a number of other issues around BEPS. in that
And
process.
dispute resolution, it happens to be one of the key areas.
Dispute resolution is a subject matter that we raised at today. Tomorrow we will have a more in-depth area around tax administration capacity building, which will also address dispute resolution. But we do not see in the long run producing at this moment producing something as direct as this. We would probably focus first on tax incentives as a very high priority area.
Okay, okay. Fine, sir. Thank you. We will move to Mr. Sumit Majumder. Sir, please tell us about the indirect tax aspects of the deliberations taking place today, sir.
Well,
And what is going to
one thing what Dan said today is very striking, and this is the crux of the theme of APTF, that APTF provides a neutral table
Right.
where all stakeholders with relation to the taxation,
Come together.
including the taxpayer, taxman, industry, academics, all come together, exchange views, and he has said that they may not agree on each point, but they come around on a consensus to disagree. They agreed to disagree on certain
Right,
points,
right.
but maybe in course of that thing, how the tax policies, better tax policies and that better tax administration reforms can take place. This is the best way of providing it.
Right,
And
sir.
I have been personally associated with this since 2010, when Government of India, Minister of Finance had nominated me. That was in the seventh APTF in Angkor Wat in Cambodia.
Oh, I
and
see.
since then, although I have retired, but they have been very kind to invite me in each of the APTFs, and it's continuing.
Right.
You've gone from a government participant to a independent expert.
Thank you.
And we don't always agree at these meetings.
Absolutely.
But what happens is we share know-how
Yes.
and we share mutual understanding. And I hope through this process we build some trust
Right.
between taxpayers and the tax authorities.
Right.
That's what we're all about. That's why ITIC exists.
Right.
That's the heart and soul of meetings like this.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And the other important point is that the number of tax experts, but I will mention about three particularly. One is Mr. Sisben Nossen.
Right.
You know that he is an expert in VAT, GST.
Right.
Then we have Mr. Jeffrey Owens,
Yes.
who is again, he has spoken on BEPS, he has spoken on incentives. And we have Mr. Dave Hartnett. He is the former chief of HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs,
Right, sir.
for long years. And I had met him first in 2008 when I had visited England as one of the delegations from India. And he has not changed a bit. Today he spoke so well. And so it's a fantastic thing that we experience.
Churning of ideas.
So now coming to the subject, I will just tell you in brief what on the indirect taxation side, the main emphasis of course would be on the GST,
Right.
as you know. And they have got the gentleman, the officer who is responsible for implementing GST in Malaysia. Right. And I only wish many Indian officers would have come, taxation officers, and attended this. They really don't know what they've missed. I believe APTF and ITIC had sent an invitation to many. Anyway, this is besides the point. So GST is one thing which will be discussed in detail. There will be a separate session on the treatment of GST for the food processing industries.
I see.
Because
Okay.
there's a tremendous concern that processed food, if the GST rate, which is very high compared to what they're paying now, that if that is implemented, what will happen to their industry?
Okay.
So this is one. Another indirect tax point, which will, in the TP session, transfer pricing session,
Sir.
Hafiz has requested me to be there to give the customs perspective on the customs valuation treatment of related parties transactions, and how we have been trying to converge the valuation treatment of in customs and income tax.
Right, sir. So let me thank all of you, sir. And before I wind up, I would like to go to Mr. Daniel and find out where exactly the ATPF is going to hold, the next conference, and what are going to be the key areas where you would like to focus on.
Well, Chandra, at the start of the morning session, at the conclusion, I should say, of the morning session, the Honorable Fadil Mohammed, the chairman of the Budget and Economics Committee of the Parliament of Indonesia, welcomed everyone to come to Jakarta in 2016 for the 13th meeting of the Asia Pacific Tax Forum. And I can't conclusively tell you what the agenda will be, because this will be discussed amongst the Ministry of Finance and the Tax Administration people tomorrow at the government-only meeting that my colleague, the former Australian Assistant Commissioner of Taxation, will chair. And we do expect continuing discussion on tax incentives, a progress report on GST. But those are a few things we expect to continue, but we also expect some new things to come up from our colleagues tomorrow.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Daniel. It's for your wonderful and praiseworthy initiatives, and for organizing and providing, a kind of bowl where a lot of new ideas being churned out and ideas getting disseminated to different economies, and hopefully lesser disputes and more revenue for the government, lesser price for the consumers, and of course, lesser disputes for the courts. So thank you all for this wonderful initiative, and wish all the best to ATPF, sir.
Thank you
for
very
the
much.
next year conference. Thank you.